Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the In Step with God podcast. I'm your host, JT Martin, and under the kind of insane circumstances, I've managed to get Dr. Stephen Long, Dr. Matthew Wilson, and Dr. Ben Voth back on the show. Each of them have been guests at a previous point in time, and we're just going to kind of be reflecting and dialoguing over everything that's happening with Russia and Ukraine and kind of just processing through what's going on, but also what it kind of looks like to be thinking faithfully as Christians of various perspectives through this, and how our faith should be informing the way that we're reacting and responding to the different things coming through in the media. So with that being said, I will go ahead and allow them to briefly introduce themselves and we'll get started. Dr. Voth, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Ben Voth, and I'm a professor of rhetoric and director of debate and speech here at Southern Methodist University.
Dr. Wilson.
I'm Matthew Wilson. I'm a professor in the political science department as well as director of the Center for Faith and Learning at Southern Methodist University.
And Dr. Long.
Hi, I'm Steve Long. I'm the McGuire Professor of Ethics at the university.
So thank you for that. I'm way kind of over my head with everything that's going on. So on kind of just a brief side, what was the buildup for this? I had heard something about Russia kind of placing some troops near the Ukraine border, maybe as early as 2 to 3 weeks before the invasion started. But was this something that just kind of happened out of nowhere, or has this been something that's been simmering for a long time? I don't know. And so I'm just kind of asking because I figure y'all may know a little bit more about some of the backstory to everything that's going on than I do.
I can speak a little bit to that. There was no particular precipitating incident for this. It's not as if Putin sent troops to the border in response to some specific provocation or to some particular incident with Ukraine or with the Western world. There is a long backstory to this. I mean, in the sense that there have been festering resentments from the Kremlin and from Vladimir Putin about the way that the Cold War ended and about the geopolitical order that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so for quite some time, Putin has been unhappy with the diminution of Russia, with the independence of the Baltics, of Ukraine, of Georgia, with the desire of those independent nations to align themselves more and more with the West. But that's been an ongoing frustration. There was nothing that you could point to in, December or January of this past year that would have said, oh, that's why all of a sudden he sent 200,000 troops to the Ukrainian border. So why he decided to pick this fight right now is really kind of a mystery. And I think it's a mystery even to a lot of Western intelligence agencies who are going so far as to speculate about his mental and physical state as being perhaps explanatory factors, because geopolitically it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Okay. Dr. Voth, Dr. Long, any thoughts to add on that?
I was just going to add a little bit. I mean, obviously, one of the key rivalries in terms of what Professor Wilson just said is the existence and expansion of NATO. That North Atlantic Treaty Organization started out decades ago with about 12 members, and it's grown to be a membership of about 30. And there's been a lot of growth since 1997. And that is, arguably, and again, I'm not really validating this, but arguably the Putin perception of what they would kind of term in intelligence circles like Russian encirclement, like that gradually these European countries, former East European satellite states of the Soviet Union, have joined NATO. The thought that Ukraine might join NATO is seen as the ultimate sort of dagger in the Russian revival that Putin, I think, imagines himself to be a part of. I think most people who know about Putin's rhetorical history know he was a KGB agent, and that he did describe that he thinks the worst thing that happened in human history was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so we know that he has rhetorical ambitions to see a greater Russia, and NATO's expansion has been a dismal counterstatement to that. And he didn't want to see Ukraine fall into the NATO orbit. I don't have any particular answers, like as Professor Wilson said, about why exactly right now. I mean, some of it almost did literally seem like, okay, we're going to wait for the Olympics to end, and then we're going to turn the switch on this and go. That's the closest thing to a trigger that I could even offer. But I think those are some of the things I would say that are pretextual, that are definitely relevant, that listeners and viewers would want to be aware of.
Okay. Dr. Long, any thoughts?
I would agree, and I would want to just offer the caveat in my own response. I'm not a Russian expert. If you want to know the backstory and the history, you should speak with someone who is. Like everybody, I've been catching up, reading here and there. And one of the interesting things that I have read among my friends who are church historians is the role the Orthodox Church plays in all of this, and how there's a tension between the Archpatriarch of Constantinople and the Archpatriarch of Moscow, and how Kyiv is something like the Jerusalem of the Russian Orthodox Church. 1 million Russian Orthodox, 100 million Russian Orthodox, as I understand, live in Russia, about 50 million in Ukraine, and that's almost half of the Orthodox population. So this really is a war between people who go to the Eucharist together and then come away, and now there's just blood on especially the Russians' hands. Because of this unjust aggression. Is Putin trying to restore the Soviet Empire? How could you deny that? He doesn't seem like he doesn't seem at all interested in kind of communism, if you will. I don't think he's trying to rebuild communism. He's a plutocrat, surrounded by plutocrats, by kleptocrats. So is there a civilizational dimension to this, that he wants a kind of alternative to Western liberalism? I think there is something to that, and that's why you see a number of people who have claimed to be post-liberal in their politics. I mean, that term can mean a variety of things. I've used it myself, and now I'm a little worried to use it anymore. But if you want to be post-liberal, they've looked to Putin and bashed NATO as the kind of bastion of liberal democracy. You see that in a number of not just people on the fringes, but people with good pedigrees, academic, intellectual pedigrees. So is that going on as well? I think it might, but we're in the midst of it. And, it's very difficult to make any sort of claims with certitude at any time, but especially when you're in the midst of something like this. So I would just want to express some caution about my own analysis as far as I've tried to understand this just horrific event.
Yeah.
And I would actually say that Putin, with this, I think in many ways surprising act, has really let down many of his defenders, the people that Steve was talking about in the Western world. I mean, so Steve's exactly right, that there have been people tending to be on what we might call the far left and the far right in the United States, although I'm cautious about the use of those terms because, Putin is neither really a left-wing nor a right-wing figure. He doesn't fit into that kind of Western political axis. But there have been people, whether it's, Bernie Sanders or Tucker Carlson, have been saying for a long time, hey, the United States does too much fear mongering about Russia. We're, expansionist, global internationalist. We're too eager to put people into NATO. We spend too much money on the military. We ought to just, focus more on things going here domestically and not be so focused on military confrontation with Russia or other powers. In part, the reason that they said that was they said that the West, and particularly the quote unquote neocons in the West, had been exaggerating the threat from people like Putin. Well, Putin's actions this week kind of gave the lie to that take. And so you see people in the wake of the invasion, again, to take the two names that I mentioned, Bernie Sanders, Tucker Carlson, both of them have defended Russia in the past, essentially after the invasion have said, yeah, this is indefensible. Right. They backed away from that. They've said, this was the thing that we have been saying for a long time was not going to happen.
Yeah.
And it happened. And so even these people who are, in some sense anti-liberal, in some ways perhaps sympathetic with Putin, nothing but the fringiest of the fringe now have anything positive to say about Putin in the wake of this invasion, because it is really just indefensible.
Yeah. So, and I'm kind of bringing up some stuff that I've seen appearing in different social media circles. There has been some speculation that I've seen, and again, obviously can't say anything with certainty, but I am curious to kind of open listeners to some more insight on some of these claims. One of them is that the reason it's right now is that, one, after the Olympics, but two, Trump is no longer in power. There have been some statements made that for all the issues that the Trump presidency had in certain regards, there are some individuals who are claiming that his presence was a discouragement of these kinds of things. I don't know how to evaluate that claim, but I figured I'd bring it up for consideration.
I can definitely say that's a hot debate topic as the debate person, and it's probably one of the dominant things that the American political sphere is going to argue about. I mean, I guess in defense of the thesis that you're asking about, I think it ought to be acknowledged, and it might not be in all circles, but is that there were actually a lot of aggressive military actions taken by the Trump administration against Russia. I'm going to kind of list three here. I mean, one is a military strike against an ostensible Russian base in Syria when there was a lot of conflict with ISIS and things like that, and possible chemical weapons use by Assad. That was provocative. A second thing that happened in that same theater was ordering essentially the killing of either 200 Russian soldiers or 200 Russian mercenaries that the U.S. thought to be rivals in the era of the Trump administration. And then finally, probably the most relevant part of that thesis is, and this is a debate between the administrations, Obama, Biden, and Trump, is the lethal aid for Ukraine. A lot of what's critical right now is, for example, Javelin missiles, which are used to take out Russian tanks. There was, a noteworthy discrepancy between lethal aid between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. So that is how that argument is defended. Now, people will also say, on the contrary, that Trump threatened to withhold some of that aid in order to bring about changes in how they were investigating what President Trump felt like should be investigated with Hunter Biden. So there's a lot of volatility in that question. But those are, three or four things that people will talk about in the American circles to try to figure that out.
I guess I don't find it a helpful question, JT. How would you know? How would you adjudicate those differences? My own sense is that Putin for a long time has been trying to, he thinks liberal democracies are mistakes. He's been trying to sow discord and division and weaken them. And if he made a miscalculation, I think that it might be that he thought that he had weakened them more than they're actually weakened. I don't know. Would he have done this under Trump? Would he have done it under Hillary Clinton? Would he have done it? I mean, you're talking about an irrational actor. So, the idea that somehow he's going to be a rational actor in terms of Western political realism or discourse, it just seems to me to be, I'm not sure he was. I'm not sure he is. I'm not sure he will be in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that this is a largely kind of unhelpful counterfactual, because we can't produce an answer to this. We can speculate, and everybody speculates largely based on their own political preferences in the American domestic context about whether things would have happened differently. Trump himself certainly has been saying this never would have happened under my watch. I mean, that's not surprising that he would make that claim. Yeah. But the reasons are are not, particularly compelling. So, I mean, he sort of seems to suggest that, well, Biden is perceived as weak and I was perceived as strong. I mean, again, kind of falsifiable, unverifiable. We don't know how these things factored into Vladimir Putin's mind. The question is whether, if we're going to put this in terms of American partisan politics, whether there is any material difference in the way that Republicans are calling for a response and the way that Democrats are calling for a response. And right now, I would say actually there's very little. This is one of those instances where partisan divisions have been pretty muted, where the mainstream of both Democratic and Republican thought right now is largely on the same page. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find anybody but the fringiest of the fringe who says anything other than we ought to stand with Ukraine with significant economic sanctions and some sort of military aid that comes short of actually putting American troops into Ukraine. I mean, that seems to be the dominant position for both Democrats and Republicans right now.
Okay.
Yeah, just to echo a little bit of what Professor Wilson said, there was a poll done this weekend that sort of verified what Professor Wilson is saying, that among Republicans and Democrats, there was nearly equal sort of vehemence about Putin transgressing and kind of being in the wrong. So there's actually a lot of bipartisan potential right now just because of the unique situation. I will say one of the things I think is sort of a touchy thing, and most analysts sort of understand this, like the Nord Stream pipeline 2, there were sanction proposals in December in the Senate that actually had 55 Senate supporters, but Chuck Schumer did invoke a filibuster rule to stop those sanctions. And that was a very ironic political act because it was at the same moment in time where the filibuster was being decried as a racist political instrument. So there's still room to kind of press some of these bipartisan things. I would think probably the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is going to face severe sanction, if not complete dysfunction. I mean, maybe even the Germans are completely opposed to it at this point. So, but there's a lot of bipartisan potential. I would definitely agree with Professor Wilson about that part.
So
I think I do, in terms of religion and the faith, I do hope this dislodges more certain sectors of the evangelical right, like Franklin Graham. I mean, I don't know how fringe is Franklin Graham. I think of him as pretty fringy. I think he comes across as someone who was very imprudent and perhaps didn't have a good sense of justice in his earlier accolades. I think this challenges a certain strand of Catholic integralism that I don't know. I find problematic. So I do think in the theology world, at least in terms of the churches and the faith, this could be a moment where, and the last thing I want to do, I mean, I don't want the idea that now we get to hate our enemy and, that brings us all together. That's really not, that might work in realpolitik, but that's not actually the way Christians are supposed to go about this. Even though I think there's a clear unjust aggressor in this, there's just no two-sidesism, if you will. There's a clear unjust aggressor. But I do hope that some of those positions, even some of them are from my former collaborators and friends who I won't name, they have, the things that they've been posting, even now that they're posting about this, I find deeply problematic. And, the prudential decisions are necessary. And when you're wrong, then it should make us all rethink some of the things that we've been doing and saying and thinking about. So,
yeah. And on that vein,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Okay.
No, well, I was just going to say quickly that, Putin's action here has really isolated him even from a lot of those people that Steve was talking about who were his defenders, these kind of, Christian integralists and things like that. So one person who's spoken out unequivocally and said that this is an abomination and intolerable is Viktor Orban.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Viktor Orban is very much a hero to some of those on what we might say the right that is skeptical about liberalism. And Orban is often held up as a kind of model or champion for them. And Orban said, there's just no way this can be tolerated. This is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. We NATO, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the whole nine yards, which is just what really, again, starts to make you wonder, what is going on with Vladimir Putin? Because he seems to have miscalculated kind of catastrophically about who might stand with him in this. And even some of the people who were inclined to be sympathetic to him, they just said, you have now done the thing that we have been telling people forever you were not going to do. Right? You have now done the thing that we have been saying was an overblown scare tactic from the neocons and the defenders of liberal democracy. And now you did it. And you can just sense the sort of vexation and disgust from those erstwhile allies. And it really makes you wonder what kind of thought process and calculus was going on for Putin.
Yeah, no, 100%. So to kind of follow up on some of Dr. Long's train of thought, this is something that I saw an article about. I didn't get a chance to read it, but the title stuck with me, and I'm reminded of it. But it's this idea of prudence as a lost virtue in some circles of evangelical theology. And again, I hadn't read the article, but given what we're talking about, I do think that there maybe is a sense in which that at least the title is striking a chord at something true. It's not often that when moments like this come, that Christians are asking the question of, okay, well, how should I be reacting? It's just this, I'm going to react along my partisan lines, at least here in America, or at least, against the aggressor. The amount of times I've seen, the slogan, pray for Ukraine. And yes, we should be, but why aren't we praying for Russia too? There's just as many people who are there because they're told to be there, or they're there because for whatever reason they believe in the vision that's been cast for them, and they're just as much people as the soldiers defending Ukraine. And so there is, I am wrestling through, kind of this idea of, okay, what even is prudence in this kind of a context, but also how should we advocate for some sort of prayerful response on the Russian side of the conflict? And if we should, how do we go about advocating for that in a way that does not try to rationalize the Russian aggression or minimize the impact that Putin's decisions are having on both sides of that border and around the globe?
I think this might begin to kind of comment on your question and also amplify what Professors Long and Wilson are saying. One of the things that is interesting about Ukraine, especially when you root it back to what Professor Long's talking about with the evangelicals, and evangelicals don't make up a sizable population really anywhere in Europe, but they actually are one of the, as far as evangelicals go, their largest population is actually in Ukraine. And so there actually is a lot of interaction between missions and things like that in Ukraine, even U.S. to Ukraine and things like that. So I think there is, here again, a lot of potential for unity that one might not typically anticipate just because of the unique natures of Ukraine. And again, some of that I think is a little bit antagonistic in the way of, in terms of viewing like an anti-communist or anti-Russian view. Evangelicals viewed Ukraine as a wedge into Russian dominance in the area and things like that. But I think you would find, I think we do find already across the Russian Orthodox Church into evangelical communities, a unity about this is abhorrent and objectionable. And I think there are people protesting even in Russia itself, very evidently against their own government's policies. And I think, a lot of that probably is church related. And I think part of where, our prayers can effectively lift up a community of unified Christian believers across a lot of different denominational perspectives to, stop what essentially most people describe as madness on the part of a very unitary executive, Putin. And so it does seem like a reasonable thing to do, to ask Christians to do.
And it seems to me, JT, at least my own prayers have been different for the Ukrainians and the Russians, although we're called to pray for both. I think there are only two appropriate responses for Christian participation in wars: pacifism or just war. Those are the only two possible responses. And it's really important, very important, that even in a just war, we make a distinction between war and murder. Even if you lean towards nonviolence, as I do, I think it's crucial to maintain the distinction between war and murder. And if the report is true, and I don't know, but if the report is true that Putin has given the Ukrainian citizens a certain amount of time to leave, and then everybody who remains is going to be considered a combatant, then what you have is Russian soldiers who will be clearly not discriminating and therefore committing murder. And I thought we learned, of course, we all thought we learned a lot of lessons from World War II that seems like we have to learn again. But just because it's your duty is no excuse. Even for soldiers, even soldiers have agency and a moral responsibility. So I think it's really important to maintain that just because it's your duty, just because you're commanded to do something, doesn't mean you should do it. And so I have been praying that some Russian soldiers would put down their arms, that they would realize that they're killing people indiscriminately. And even because I don't think there's a just cause for this war, right? I mean, that's one of the criteria. One of the criteria for a just war is there has to be what's the just cause for this war? There's been none proclaimed. I mean, there's just silliness about Zelensky being a drug addict and a Nazi, which is just absurd. So there's no just cause for this. So if you're not fighting a just cause in terms of a just war, what are you doing? Well, I mean, in some sense, I think as theologically, you would have to say that these are salvific matters. You can't just take up arms and indiscriminately kill people and say, what's a little murder among friends? The blood itself cries out for justice. And just so theologically, I think it'd be really important to maintain this. And some of the Orthodox priests and bishops, especially in Ukraine and even some in Russia, have been very intent on this. I've been really disappointed in Kirill, the Archpatriarch of Moscow, I believe. His statements I find just woefully inadequate and disappointing. But there are others that I've been really trying to listen to. The Methodist bishop of Ukraine and Russia, that Ukraine and Russia are a single conference in the Methodist Church. The Methodist bishop is in charge of both of them. And his statements have just been really powerful. So I do want to listen to voices other than, I get really tired of cable news because they trot out the same people who got us involved in the last war to talk about this war. And you think, really, is there nobody new that you could actually get to explain these things to us? And it's the same old analysis. So I do want to get some alternative voices out there. And one of the places you do it is in church periodicals and statements coming out of various church groups.
Yeah.
So, JT, I would say in terms of Christian responses here, I'm thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and what Bonhoeffer said were basically the three major categories of things that Christians could do when confronted with injustice. And Bonhoeffer said that one thing that Christians can do and are called to do is, of course, to speak out against the injustice. So to name it for what it is and to say that it is wrong. Second thing that Christians can do is to, as he put it, to bandage those who are ground beneath the wheel of injustice, right? So that's the humanitarian assistance angle. That's trying to provide, medical care, food relief, whatever can be done to help those who are victims of the injustice. And then the third thing that Christians can do, and this is the one that Bonhoeffer himself acknowledged was most problematic and most difficult from the standpoint of Christian conscience is to actually put a spoke in the wheel of injustice, to actually do something tangible to prevent the injustice from going forward. And what does that look like? And of course, for Bonhoeffer, what he was wrestling with was it moral? Was it licit for him to actively participate in a plot to kill Hitler, right? Was essentially regicide the morally justified response? And he ultimately decided, yes. Bonhoeffer decided that he was called as a Christian to participate in a plot to kill Hitler. But that was the one of those three responses that he was morally uneasy about, right? The other two, essentially, he said, those are no-brainers. Yes, Christians should speak out against injustice. Yes, Christians should bandage those who are ground beneath the wheel. But what does it look like for us to put a spoke in the wheel? And this then becomes the question of what level of military resistance to the Russian invasion should Christians countenance? What does that look like? And this then comes into some of those debates that Steve was talking about, pacifism versus just war and what those sorts of things look like. Yeah. One other point I would make about the church, it's been said already, and this is very much true, that the principal religious denomination involved here is the Orthodox Church, right? The majority of people, both in Russia as well as in Ukraine, are Orthodox Christians. And it's important historically and theologically to understand a distinction between the Orthodox Church and the Western churches. And this is deep-rooted in history. Historically, the Orthodox Church has been deeply statist. Okay? What I mean is there is not the legacy of separation of political authority, civil government from religious authority or the church in the East that developed in the West. And that goes all the way back to the split of the Roman Empire, right? Where, in the early days of the Orthodox Church, you had what they call Caesaropapism. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but you've got this long historical tradition where the Orthodox Church is essentially handmaiden to the state. In the West, and here's where I'm going with this, in the West, if you saw a kind of wildly unprovoked aggression like this launched by the state, you would expect that many Western churches would aggressively speak out against that and condemn the state, whether it's Catholic Church, Protestant churches, whatever. And we saw, very strong religious involvement with the anti-war movement during Vietnam, for example. Lots of clergy people were out in the streets leading demonstrations against the war. You're not seeing that in Russia. For a whole host of reasons, but part of it is that there is a real reticence in Orthodox Christianity to speak against the civil power. And that is an important distinction, I think, that people need to understand, and it has deep historic roots.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing I'm just going to jump in on here is that for me, the rhetorical parts of this are interesting, and Professors Wilson and Long are kind of talking about the World War II components of this. But I think it's important, and I think everybody gets it, but that in terms of Putin's statements and things like that, one of the justifications he's offering is the denazification of Ukraine. I mean, it's a fairly ridiculous thing to say in light of Zelensky being an elected Jew into public office of Ukraine. I mean, it really should cause everyone, especially the Christian community, to uniformly understand that this is fairly absurd. And a second thing I just want to comment rhetorically upon is that the second prong of his justification is this idea that Russians are being subjected to genocide in eastern Ukraine. And again, I don't think the arguments there are credible. And I think, again, Christians need to stand for a candor and an honesty and a truth that liberates public policy to its best ends and speaking the truth. And so really what Putin has said in his own defense about these actions is fairly ridiculous and absurd and doesn't meet really any threshold standards about, like, if we're saying just war and things like that. So, I mean, that's the only thing I would add to what Professors Long and Wilson have already said very effectively.
I agree with what my colleagues are saying. I would add this as well. Like everyone, I'm praying for really a miracle, and that somehow the Ukrainian forces or, the Russia, somebody comes to their senses and just stops this aggression. But if the aggression continues, it's really hard for me to see how Ukraine doesn't in the end lose. But all that means is that Ukraine has lost militarily, and it doesn't mean that the aggression has to stand. So what Dr. Wilson said about the command, Bonhoeffer's second command, still remains, and you can still do something. There are, this happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. There were strong nonviolent movements. I mean, who knew? I mean, it happened in Denmark, right? I mean, when you're coming up against superior military force, it's courageous, it's honorable, to stand up, but at the same time, you're going to have to. It doesn't mean you have to be governed by them. It's not like, oh, well, once they take Kyiv or some of the major cities, well, it's all over. How do you govern 50 million people who don't want to be governed by you? There's all kinds of things that you can do after that. And one of the things we need is an imaginative, because I don't think you can just sort of figure that out. We need imaginative practices to figure out how you can stick, something in the spokes of the wheel before you have to do it. And, that's what the civil rights movement did. They actually trained and practiced. And it wasn't like the southern part of the United States was all like nonviolent pacifists, right? And they were just going to welcome these nonviolent protesters. That's just not true. But yet they won. They won. And why did they win? Because of these nonviolent practices. So I don't want to think of nonviolence as somehow, something that doesn't have, that it's not passivism. It's a way of engaging. You don't have to be subject to force and authority. In fact, I think you have an obligation not to be. And I'm not sure what that's going to mean for the Ukrainians in the future.
Okay. So, this is why I wanted to make this episode, because I mean, the amount of complexities involved in really just kind of taking the moment to kind of at least try to sort through some of this. A couple of things that stick out to me, what does it look like theologically, right, to maybe gain an appreciation for why certain Russian Orthodox officials in the church aren't speaking out against this, because that I feel like in certain regards, to the Western mind, that's somewhat incomprehensible, and I'll be the first to admit it. I when I was looking for information kind of coming out of different circles, trying to figure out, okay, what's the church saying, what's going on theologically and things like that, and I'll admit, from what I could find, there was kind of this silence outside of a couple of different people popping up here and there within the Russian Orthodox circle. And so, Dr. Wilson, bringing up what you did about the historical kind of connection there and kind of really grounding some of that response in history, it makes more sense. Now then, I'm not necessarily going to say here and try to say right or wrong on that, but it does make more sense in a sort of understanding kind of way. There's a level of empathy that kind of information allows me as a Christian to have for ministers in Russia who are having to sort through very difficult decisions for them in accordance to their tradition and history. And I think that's something that a lot of believers gain benefit from, if I'm being honest. And so one, I guess maybe to kind of round off our time, one final question-ish. We may have time for one more. Who knows? What would each of you say are, on the one hand, to young individuals who are in college, who are kind of wrestling, especially for men. Most of us had to sign up for selective service when we turned 18. I know I did. I had to, in order to be able to apply to vote. Thinking through that, what happens if they activate selective service, if the violence continues on past Ukraine, if Ukraine falls militarily? That's very difficult for me to think through and think about. But then on the other side of that, kind of on the parental side, what does it look like to be leading conversations in a family setting about what's going on in this as Christians? Because I think that a lot of times when situations like this occur, parents look to the church to try and give their kids answers. And I don't necessarily know if the church is giving the greatest holistic Christian response on this, from what I've seen. So just two things that I'd really appreciate each of your perspectives on.
I guess I'll jump in a little bit. I mean, I like I said, I'm teaching this Rhetoric of Genocide class this semester, and so we're having these discussions in class. I mean, I had a student this past class period ask, in light of this, are the Russians targeting missiles on the United States? And actually, this was before, obviously, Putin kind of escalated the nuclear weapons status, which is fairly alarming. But I would say, as I said to her, I actually don't think the risks are the same or comparable to, for example, the Cold War kind of 1960s all the way through the 1980s. I don't think like a missile attack on the United States is imminent, like in the way of a Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that. I think that students should not be radically apprehensive. To put it in really particular Christian context, I mean, I always think it's important for Christians to understand. I mean, and right now I know Professor Wilson and I are working on this directly. Like, we're studying the book of Acts in the faculty and staff Bible study here at SMU and looking at, the very early persecution of the church by Saul, who becomes Paul, and very violent, deadly things are happening to Stephen and to the church and things like that. And, Christianity emerges out of some very dark political shadows. I mean, Herod and many other things that we could name. And we also have direct interactions between Jesus and soldiers that, certainly must have seemed challenging, not just to Jesus, but even to the disciples and the local populations observing these local oppressors. I think there's always an optimism to Christianity that we need to defend and instill and to teach. And I would say, even in response to what to Professor Long, I think some of what he said in his last comments actually, to me, were kind of notes of optimism in the way that I don't think Ukraine actually can be conquered by the Russians for a lot of the reasons that Professor Long articulated. And I would also say, just in my own opinion of looking at international affairs, semi-miraculous things have happened to my mind, which are, for example, Germany's switch on this issue in the last week or so is actually rather startling to me, and actually another sort of death knell to Putin's ambitions. Now, having said all of that, I think there are risks, and they've been hinted at in this conversation with regard to Putin's mental status and his desperation. But there's also a part of me that says, and I'm not the only analyst who said this, that there could be a coup flu in Moscow and that Putin could find himself, not in charge of Russia, because this just looks so irrational and so much of a dead end. I say that mainly to say that God can work miracles and can do the things that reverse the course of history. And I think, again, a famous moment in church history, and not always valorized, but the sudden switch of the Roman Empire into a Christian empire, and that didn't bring all benefits when it happened, but it was certainly something no one probably would have predicted in 70 AD, that all of a sudden the Roman Empire would switch to something completely different. So I think Christians need to keep the open, realistic, pragmatic mind that is prayerful, but mindful that God can change the course of history in a positive way. And I actually do see some inklings of that are different than World War II, that are unique to our 21st century. And that's what I'm saying to my daughters, my students, and even my church classes, out in Rockwall. So that's kind of where I'm at on that.
Well, I would say with regard to this, first of all, just as a note of personal reassurance, I think it is exceedingly unlikely that selective service is going to be activated in the United States. The U.S. military, quite honestly, does not want a bunch of conscript soldiers. The U.S. military is very happy with the professional armed forces that they have come to have. So it's hard to imagine the activation of selective service short of some sort of invasion of the U.S. homeland. So I don't think people are at serious risk of being, called up for military service. That being said, though, the very thought of that should give young people in America sympathy with what is going on in the Russian armed forces, because many of the Russian soldiers who are in Ukraine right now are conscripts. They are people who are doing mandatory military service. They are not people who chose a military career. They're people who are required to take up arms and have now been sent into Ukraine with very little understanding of why they're there. And so, excuse me. So I think that those are people for whom young people in America can pray and can have some understanding of how difficult that would be to be sent into a hornet's nest like that for reasons that are entirely unclear to you, with no choice, where you are a conscript soldier. And that is what a lot of people in the Russian military are facing.
Yeah, Matthew's exactly right about selective service. I don't think that there's any chance of this. I think it takes like $5,000 to outfit one American soldier. So it's so technological now, and the military doesn't want it. I actually wrote an essay a few years ago on why we should have what's it called? Not conscription.
Compulsory.
Mandatory service, because one of my big fears is that we've been at war for the last 20, 25 years. How many people at SMU have been affected by it, even remotely? Now there have been some, but we don't. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a product of Vietnam, and I remember the fear of being called up to Vietnam. It just ended after I signed my conscript letter, whatever it was, and I mean, it was very palpable. It was there. And I do think you do have an obligation to your neighbors, maybe not to take up arms, but to do something for the common good. And I really worry that we've lost that. And I also worry that we have a kind of military culture, which can easily become separated from, I don't think it has, but it can become separated from democratic oversight, which is necessary. So I wonder, I mean, not that I'm advocating for this, because I think it would be a disaster, but just to be challenged. What are you going to do? I worry, are we prepared to do things? Pope Francis has asked everyone to fast, beginning, Lent starts on Wednesday, Ash Wednesday. What would it mean for us to say, we as a nation, even if it's just a symbolic gesture, we're going to go 2 days and we're going to use the least amount of oil we can possibly use, just to show the world that we care and that we can learn to live without. I'm not sure we have a people capable of doing that anymore, and that concerns me. But to get to your other question about what do we tell our families, I think one of the things, and here's where my Methodist, Anabaptist, disestablishment, non-Constantinian Christianity comes out. I think one of the things we have to remind people is the nation is not a salvific entity. The nation is not redemptive. And one of the problems, I think, with certain Russian Orthodoxy, certain forms of Orthodoxy, and mind you, I know a number of Russian Orthodox who are not like that, who are very unhappy with Kirill and with this synodality, which suggests that you should have this symbiosis between the nation, the state, the empire. I think it's really important for the church to remind the nation and even the leaders of the nation that they have a limited role in the divine economy. And it's something that you have to do every generation. Ambrose had to do it to Theodosius. I know the history, it's complicated, but there used to be an old saying, if you want a Theodosius, you have to have an Ambrose, who did at least send him a letter and say, you can't come to the Eucharist, you have blood on your hands. Maximus the Confessor did it in the East. That's why we call him Maximus the Confessor, telling the emperor he couldn't make doctrine, to which the emperor cut out his tongue and his right hand. I mean, Franz Jagerstatter, just a faithful Catholic layperson, refused to fight under Hitler, even though he was a conscript. Now, I think that takes incredible courage. I don't even know I don't know if I have that kind of courage, mind you. I think it would take the Holy Spirit to infuse it within you. But that's always possible. And we should lift up these stories again and again and again to remind people, in my estimation, that the nation has a very limited role. One of the things I fear about and I came out through evangelical. I went to Taylor University. That's, Wheaton College's cheap stepsister. One of my fears is especially the evangelical world got co-opted. They didn't have an adequate ecclesiology, an understanding of the church. And so they got co-opted and replaced the church with a nation. And so they weren't able to differentiate the flag from the cross. I remember once when I was a pastor in North Carolina, it was Lent. We took everything out of the church. I took the cross out of the sanctuary. Afterwards, and I'm not saying, and I took the flag out of the sanctuary. Afterwards, I put the cross back in. I didn't put the flag back in. Everybody in the church noticed. Everybody. And, I've often wondered, why did they notice that? What was the object of gaze? And that's not to say, I got a great uncle who was one of the few people who was in a concentration camp in World War II. He was a heroic man. That's not to deny it, but it is to say that the nation's not salvific. It has a limited role, and we have to remind it of its limited role. The nations are created by God. They are going to bring their good to the New Jerusalem, but they are not the New Jerusalem. That might be controversial, but I hope not. Catholics believe this.
Yeah, sure.
Right? That's not controversial, is it, Dr. Wilson?
Well, in fact, one thing that we could pray for is that there would be a Russian Orthodox Thomas Becket, that there would be a clergyman within the Russian Orthodox Church who is willing, even unto the ultimate price, to tell the king, no, you will not have your will, right? And I will speak out against you. And it takes incredible courage. And of course, Becket was martyred for defying the king. And sometimes that's where that ends up. But there is, I just thought of him as another example in that line of people that you're talking about who were churchmen who spoke against the power of the state at great personal cost. So,
and maybe this is a stretch, but
one thing I guess I might say, just to kind of echo Professor Long, because he was alluding to this earlier about, the civil rights movement and that kind of thing. And in looking at the history of that movement, a lot of its key parts emerged early, actually during the World War II era in the 1940s. And many of the civil rights leaders were conscientious objectors, and they wouldn't serve militarily. But what I think sometimes is looked over in that history is that they were very adamant about being kind of in the way that Professor Long described, about being disciplined in terms of the nonviolence, like willing to risk and to endure, again, violent abuse and things like that. And obviously, great examples like John Lewis and things like that, where people are physically attacked and then they don't retaliate, but that required a similar kind of internal discipline to being in the military. And they actually drew those analogies rather freely, especially in the 1940s, that they too were soldiers, but of a different kind and of a disciplined, non-violent type. And again, I'm not saying that is strictly how things must be. I actually grew up in a Mennonite tradition for a period of time here in Dallas when I was a teenager. And I have to admit that was something I disagreed with the Mennonite church about. I didn't think it was immoral to serve as a soldier militarily, but I do respect and understand the civil disobedience and the nonviolent strategies. And honestly, I think I see some of that, at least in some of this footage coming out of Ukraine, where you see women confronting Russian soldiers and things like that and challenging them on what are they doing here on this soil. And that's where I guess, I may have some pause about, the nationalism thing. And I understand the risk of it, but it's that it's hard not to see in Ukraine a kind of suffering servant. And that is hazardous. I get that. But I think that the nation there is kind of motivated in trying to overcome a very vicious, powerful opponent. And so I think it's natural that, the church is calling in a nationalistic way for saving the nation. I saw similar things when I was in Rwanda in 2019 in terms of them talking about the aftermath of the genocide. And so I don't want to block that rhetorically. I understand the hazards of being a nationalist and that kind of thing. And I think what the Russian president is doing is absurd. But I think we also need to understand that from the side of the victims, there is a hope that God is going to save the nation. And then maybe we shouldn't wish that they would think that way, but I do understand why people do that.
Yeah. So again, out of respect for time, I'm going to kind of go ahead and wind this down. More than anything, I am deeply appreciative for each of you for kind of making the time on such short notice for a conversation like this. I know that all three of you are incredibly busy people with incredibly busy lives at times, and so I'm deeply appreciative of that and for that. And so I'm also even more convinced that it's going to be worthwhile to follow up on some of the individual strains of conversation, because on the one side, Dr. Long, we could very easily have spent the entire time really kind of teasing out, what is the difference between just war, pacifism, nonviolence, and all of these kinds of things in that specific context. Dr. Wilson, we could spend an entire episode looking at the history of the relationship between the Orthodox Church and Russian politics. I mean, that's an entire episode in and of itself. And Dr. Voth, rhetoric, again, that's an entire episode in and of itself. And so I'm convinced at this point, given this conversation, to follow up with each of you on those things to coordinate a more specific episode on some of these aspects. So with that being said, thank you. I am deeply grateful for my own benefit. I've come away with maybe a little bit of a sense of peace of how to think about and help others think through what's going on. And I'm sure that a number of others who hear this will as well. So this has been the In Step with God podcast, and we will see you next time.